What's going on, guys? Billy here, and today I'm going to be walking through the Phantom 4 Pro camera settings to show you guys how to get the best image quality possible. Now for starters, I've reset all of my camera settings back to their default state, so if you'd like to go along with me throughout this video, that's where I'm starting from. Throughout this video I'm going to have screenshots that will guide you step by step on how to get the perfect camera settings. Before we begin, I'd like to show you some sample footage using these exact settings. This sample footage again has been posted on this channel before in a separate video, but I figured I'd put it in this video as well to show you guys what our ending result will be. So now that we've finished that, we can finally begin. Our first step is to click the icon above the shutter button that features the camera and the camcorder with two arrows. This will bring us into the video mode. Before we move any further throughout the settings, I'd like to point something out on the main screen. In the top right corner we have some values that are fairly important to keep track of while we're flying. The first is the ISO, the second is the shutter, the third is the aperture, the fourth is the exposure value, and then we have the white balance. Now next to that we have another gray box that features some different information about the SD card. The first is the status, and the second is the remaining capacity. In order to move along into our advanced camera settings, we're going to want to click the icon underneath of the record button that features 3 lines and 3 dots. Once in our advanced camera settings, you'll see that we have 3 different tabs to choose from. To start things off, we're going to choose the middle tab that features the camera icon. Within this tab, we can change things such as the video size, the video format, our NTSC/PAL, the white balance, the style, the color, as well as the camera video coding. First up, inside of video size, we get to choose our resolution as well as the frame rate that we'd like to shoot at. We have 2 versions of 4K, the first being Cinema 4K and the second being Ultra HD. After that, we can choose from 2.7K, 1080p, or 720p. As far as the frame rates are concerned, for both versions of 4K, we get to choose between 24, 30, 48, and 60 frames per second. Moving down to 2.7K, we get the same options of 24, 30, 48, and 60 frames per second. When we move down to 1080p as well as 720p, we get an option to shoot in 120 frames per second, along with 24, 30, 48, and 60 frames per second. Now as far as which resolution size to choose, I would say to always shoot in 4K. Whether you shoot in Cinema 4K, which is 4096 by 2160, or you shoot in Ultra HD, which is 3840 by 2160, it's all up to you. Both of them are the same, but just have a different look. For example, Cinema 4K has the black lines on the top and bottom, but that does mean that the picture is a bit longer. So whatever effect that you're going for, you can choose accordingly. As far as frame rate goes, I've broken it down into 2 separate groups. We have group 1, which is 24 and 48 frames per second. Then we have group 2, which is 30 and 60 frames per second. Depending on which one you like to shoot at, you're always going to want to choose 48 or 60, never 24 or 30. The reasoning behind this is that if you shoot at 24, you can never go up to 48, and if you shoot at 30, you can never go up to 60. But when shooting at 48 or 60, you always have the luxury to downgrade to 24 or 30 frames per second. Whenever I record, I usually shoot in 60 frames per second as well as Cinema 4K, therefore you can always crop your image down to Ultra HD. The next we have the video format, and this is all about the different file names. This pretty much stands for .mp4 and .mov. Now this all does depend on what editing platform that you'll be using. When using a PC, select .mp4. When using a Mac, select .mov. That just is what is most compatible with those different platforms. Moving along, we have our NTSC/PAL, and this is all dependent on where you live. If you live in the United States, select NTSC. If you live in Europe, select PAL. Next up, we have our white balance, and this is something that you'll want to choose before you start shooting, never in the middle of shooting, as you want the colors to always stay the same. This is just the easiest for your post-production workflow. Now we have a few different presets to choose from. We have auto, sunny, cloudy, and custom. The other 2 you're going to want to leave alone, as I've never gotten good results when shooting with those. Auto white balance can get the job done, but I find that sometimes using that, it is a bit tricky finding the correct colors in post. So therefore, if it's sunny, just simply use sunny. If it's cloudy, simply use cloudy. I would say use custom, as we always do want to use custom or manual controls when possible, but I do find it hard to set your custom white balance when on a tiny phone screen. Just for reference, as far as custom white balance goes, if we drag the slider all the way to the left, we get a colder image. Dragging it all the way to the right, we will get a warmer image. Next up we have style, and underneath of here we see 3 icons. Those 3 icons from left to right are sharpness, contrast, and saturation. Now we can set these to custom values ranging from -3 all the way up to +3, but usually I like to select standard and add my sharpness, contrast, or saturation in post. Next up we have our color profiles, and think of these as filters for Instagram or Photoshop. We have things such as film A, film B, or D-Log, which many people do like to shoot in, but for me personally, I like to stick in none, and I think that you should too, as this is what will get you to the truest colors. Not only will you get better colors from using none under color profile, but I do think that it's easier to color correct later in post. Next up, we have our camera video coding. We can choose between H.264 or H.265. Now I would choose H.264 as I am shooting in 4K at 60 frames per second, and whenever you try to switch to H.265 you get an error message saying that you cannot use that camera coding when using a higher frame rate. Now it does suck that we can't use H.265 with 60 frames per second, but if you are going to be shooting at a lower frame rate such as 30, then you can use H.265 when filming. Now that we're all finished with that middle tab featuring the camera icon, let's move over to the third tab featuring the gear icon, which houses many miscellaneous camera settings. Many of these different settings should stay untouched, so I will walk through and show you guys which ones to turn on. The first thing that we're going to want to do is turn the histogram on. You'll see a small window pop up that has mountains ranging from left to right. Now this is going to be easy for us to see whether a shot is over or underexposed. Basically, if the mountains are more towards the right, that means that your shot is overexposed and it's too light. If your shots are too far to the left, it's too underexposed and therefore too dark. The histogram is perfect for a drone flyer, as normally you are focused on piloting your drone, but this does give you an on-the-fly look at whether or not your shot is too bright or too dark. Next up, we're going to select the setting that says front LEDs auto turn off. This is to ensure that the lights don't show up in your shot. Next up, we have our autofocus and manual focus assistant. I would say turn both of these on, as it is sometimes hard to remember to focus your shot. Next up is the grid. We can choose between none, grid lines, or grid lines plus diagonals. Now usually I fly with these off, but it is smart to choose grid lines before you start flying. This will ensure that the gimbal is nice and centered with something that's in the shot. Next up, we have our center points, and we have many to choose from. Usually I like to select a center point. Again, it's all personal preference. I go with the bracket with center point, and this helps you line up your shot if you're trying to, say, follow train tracks or a river. It also can be helpful when trying to set a point of interest shot using your intelligent flight modes. And next up, we have anti-flicker, and this all depends on where you live. If you live in Europe, select 50 Hz. If you live in the United States, select 60 Hz. What anti-flicker does is make sure that the fluorescent light bulbs in your shots don't flicker. Next up, we have our file index mode. We can choose between reset and continuous. Basically, how reset works is whenever you record, you know how you get DJI 1, 2, 3 different file names. Well, once you offload those to your hard drive, you pop the SD card back in the drone, you'll start recording again at DJI 1, 2, 3. But if you choose continuous, let's say you have DJI 1, 2, 3, offload it to your hard drive, pop the SD card back in, you'll start all over at 4, 5, and 6. I would select continuous if I were you, just so that when offloading your footage, you don't accidentally overwrite another video file. Next up, we have camera settings, where we can save our different custom presets to change on the fly. So that pretty much wraps up that third tab. Now we're going to move over to the first tab, which features the aperture icon in the top left corner. First thing is first, we have a slider at the top that allows us to choose between auto, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual. With aperture priority selected, our shutter speed is set automatically for us, while we can change our aperture on the fly. When switching over to shutter speed, it's basically flip-flopped. The aperture is set automatically, while the shutter we get to set on our own. For us, we're going to want to choose manual. This will allow us to set our camera settings just right. Now moving down the line, defining these terms, basically the ISO is the sensitivity to light. The aperture is pretty much controlling the amount of light that reaches the image sensor, and the shutter speed is the length or time that the camera shutter is open to expose the camera to light. Finally, we have the EV or exposure value at the bottom. This is basically ranging between -3 and +3, and this does what the histogram does by telling us if our shot is over or underexposed. Usually you want to stick around 0. If you have anywhere between 0.5 or -0.5, you should be fine. The first thing that we should do is set our ISO value after selecting manual controls. We always want to stick between 100 and 400, as anything over will give us a more noisy image. Now if you're shooting at nighttime, I would select going up to 400, as it will make the image brighter, but usually I like to stick to 100 whenever filming during the day. Next up is the shutter speed, and there's a rule of thumb when selecting this. Basically, you take your frames per second, multiply that by 2, and that's what your shutter speed is. So let's say that your frames per second is 60, we're going to use a 120 shutter speed. Finally, all that's left to do is set our aperture. As you can see, the higher we go, the darker the image gets and the lower the exposure value is. The lower the aperture we select, the higher the exposure value is. Basically, the aperture is always going to depend on what the weather conditions like are outside. If it's sunny, you may have a different value than what I have right now, as it is a tad bit cloudy outside. Basically, at the end of the day, you're going to want to set the aperture to make sure that the exposure value is as close to 0 and the histogram mountains range more towards the middle. Now, the final tip that I can give to you guys is to purchase an ND filter. I'm still waiting on mine through DJI for my Phantom 4 Pro, as the Phantom 4 ones don't fit the new Pro version. So again, I'm just waiting on those, but they do make your shots look so much better. But anyway, this video is coming to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed. Definitely make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new around here, as I have been trying to upload daily, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.